Good afternoon, everybody. We are reconvening our afternoon Board of County Commissioners meeting for February 4th, 2020. And the first up is item 10 from our agenda regarding public works. We're going to have a discussion regarding land management division code compliance program improvements. That's a long sentence there. We have with us Kira Miller, our land management division manager. Feel free to start any time.
Great. Thank you, and good afternoon, commissioners. As Chair Buck mentioned, we're here to talk about hopeful improvements to Lane County's code enforcement program. We've got quite a bit to talk about. It's been a number of years since we've had a check-in with the board about this particular program. Quick rundown on what I want to cover, and then there will be plenty of time for questions at the end. First, I want to talk a little bit about the purpose of the code enforcement program, its responsibilities, cover the existing priorities that staff have when working on code enforcement issues. We'll discuss some of the challenges of the program. Then I have two items to discuss. One is concerning proposed code enhancements that the board could choose to look into to potentially improve our processes and ensure better code enforcement practices in the county. And then we also have a number of programmatic improvements in addition to policy changes in lane code. There's a number of things that Land Management Division is currently undertaking to enhance the code compliance program. I want to talk about those. Finally, we'll talk about next steps and we'll seek some board direction. There's really two main things that staff is hoping to get a direction on from the board, and I'll get into those in just a few minutes. So first of all, the purpose of Lane County's code enforcement program is to protect people and property from fire, health, and public safety hazards by enforcing land use, building code, sanitation, and nuisance regulations in a fair and consistent manner. So staff really endeavors to promote public health and safety and to ensure that we have a livable, vibrant community through fair, consistent administration of our land use, building, sanitation codes. Just to talk about some of the common violations that the enforcement program deals with. We deal with a number of building and sanitation, land use, and nuisance code infractions. Typically things like construction without building permits or electrical permits. Those are a major concern because of the potential health safety risks involved with that. We see a number of occupied RVs. This is a growing issue, especially with the housing concerns that we're seeing. We see a number of people living in RVs. There is a number of dangerous buildings that staff encounter. These are kind of makeshift dwellings, oftentimes out of sheds or tents or other things that don't have building permits, and then failing septic systems. On the land use side, we see again people living in dwellings without proper approvals, unpermitted commercial activities, riparian violations are a really big one that we've been seeing more and more of recently. There have been a number of reported. I think last year alone, we had a record number of riparian violations. About 30 or so were reported. Other more common things like property setback violations or exceeding the number of animals you're allowed in a zone. As far as nuisance violations go, this is one of the most visible problems in the county, which I know the board sees a lot of these kind of incidents where there's a blighted property in the community, there's a large amount of solid waste, garbage, and other things that are accumulating, oftentimes accompanied by a number of nuisance vehicles. So that's a big concern, and that's actually what's driving a lot of the work that staff is doing now. And then there's other violations, our prohibited noise ordinance. We have some regulations around outdoor gatherings. And then staff actually enforces a number of compliance standards within the urban growth boundary of Eugene and Springfield. So our staff is sort of a leftover remnant of when we transferred authority to the city of Eugene and Springfield for building and planning work a number of years ago. The county, for whatever reason, retained that code enforcement authority. And I've done some research, and I can't tell if that was just an oversight or if it was intentional, but it appears that it wasn't really a planned thing. So staff has the responsibility of trying to enforce some city standards inside the urban growth boundary, things like nuisance vegetation, which when you look at the grand scheme of the sort of priority issues that county compliance staff are dealing with, overgrown grass is a pretty low priority. So we'll talk about some of those priorities that staff have to work on. Things like nuisance vegetation is not something that we're currently staffed to prioritize. This is just a little chart that talks about kind of ranks in terms of the number of overall complaints that we see. You can see solid waste accumulation is the highest. We see the highest number of complaints about that. In recent years, again, a number of RVs being used as dwellings, general zoning violations, building violations. That's just sort of a rank so the board understands the type, the nature, and the relative amount of complaints that we see. So with all of that different work that the compliance staff is tasked with dealing with, a number of different types of violations, and the sheer size of Lane County, and the fact that there's only 2 code enforcement officers, and historically there have been more, there have been less. But back in 2003, the board established a list of priorities for code enforcement staff, because obviously staff cannot respond to all of the violations that are coming in with resources at hand. So there was a task force that was formed. It was made up of the usual development community individuals as well as environmental groups. Is a pretty well-balanced task force. And they established a number of priorities for code enforcement that then was brought to the board and approved through a board order. And these are the priorities here. I think overall, as is discussed in the packet, it seems like the task force, at least from staff standpoint, got it pretty right, the way that these priorities are evaluated. So priority 1 concerns are those violations that present an imminent threat to public health, safety, and the environment. So those sort of buildings without permits, structurally unsafe, or activities that could be degrade the environment, for example, water quality impacts. Those are priority 1 issues. The second priorities are violations that have an adverse impact on the neighborhood. So these could be things like, the nuisance properties where it's impacting, it's having an adverse impact on the neighborhood. Maybe there's not a health safety risk involved. Sometimes there is with those properties, but not always. That would be a second priority. And third violations are things that have a minimal impact on property owners, the environment, or health safety. So these are things like maybe a shed has been built within the setback of the property line, or within the zone they're allowed to have 3 sheep and they have 4 sheep, things like that, things that have a more de minimis impacts. So those are the third priorities. In terms of the staff resources that we have, we focus on all priority 1 issues. We focus on priority 2 issues as well, but they are, we deal with those as we can. A number of priority 3 violations don't get responded to in a timely manner, and sometimes don't get responded to at all. And that's something that obviously we are concerned about. It's not something that doesn't reflect the kind of customer service that we want to provide, but it's a reality of the staffing issues at the county in terms of code compliance. So the reason we're here today, really 3 things are coming together. 1, the Land Management Division has been going through a very comprehensive overhaul of its regulations, code enforcement regulations, as well as land use and building code regulations. So an update to Lane Code Chapter 5, which is our enforcement regulations, is part of that work plan of the code modernization project. A second thing that is occurring right now is I've been in this role less than a year, about 6-7 months since I was formally in this position. I'm just starting to learn and understand the code compliance program in more detail, and I'm doing an assessment of it, and I'm realizing some of the pitfalls, some of the areas that are working, and some of the areas that need improvement. So there's an overall division-wide sort of assessment of the program going on. And then of course, back in the fall, the board had heard of a number of instances, and you hear about them often, of nuisance properties that have maybe been in disrepair for a number of years. There's been ineffective code enforcement action against those properties, and they just kind of linger out there. And there's been a desire to get some more tools in our toolbox to be able to respond to those types of issues in a more timely manner. So that's also stemming from board direction. We're coming to you with really what I hope to provide is a menu of options for the board to look at today, to pick and choose which things work, to talk about, again, code enhancements as well as programmatic enhancements. So the hope at the end of this sort of program-wide assessment is that we'll have a number of positive outcomes. The first one being, our intent is to try to improve deterrence and see less violations in the county. We prefer not to see violations occur, to work collaboratively with the public and resolve issues in a voluntary manner. We don't want to be punitive, so we'd rather see violations prevented in the first place. When they do occur, of course, we want to see a faster resolution on issues. Some of these cases will linger out there for 2, 3, 4 years, and we'd like to be able to bring those cases to faster resolution. As I mentioned, we have a program in place that does have, penalties and certain punitive measures, but it's also intended to first try to achieve compliance voluntarily. We want to maintain that. That seems like in evaluating different programs around the state, those that have a higher voluntary collaborative element seem to be more successful. You can certainly deal with a large amount of the issues that way, and it seems to be less work and angst for everyone. Of course, we want to maintain property values, reduce health and safety risks. Those are very important, and overall enhance the livability of the community and improve the quality of life. So those are sort of the intent, the purpose of the code enforcement program, and those are things we'd like to see enhanced through this process. Before I get into the challenges that we face with the program, and there are a lot, I want to first highlight some of the positive things. The program does work in a number of impressive ways. I will say that the tools that we do have in place, the administrative enforcement process, it is an effective tool for a number of the issues that we see. To compare and contrast that, a number of different jurisdictions have a citation process where they will actually issue a ticket to a property owner. It's more of an enforcement sort of where somebody comes out and issues a ticket. It ends up in court and it can be litigated. We have an administrative enforcement process where we will send and we'll talk about how the process works, where we will send a letter to the individual. We'll send them advance notice that fines will begin if they don't comply. And that process does work in a number of cases. So I don't want to necessarily do away with that, but there are some additional tools that we could use and fold into that existing process that can make staff more effective. The second is we've seen tremendous support from legal counsel, especially over the last year. There have been a couple of high priority projects, some pretty well-known foreclosure properties that we've had great support from County Counsel. Sebastian Tapia, in particular, has done a great job negotiating with banks on some of these foreclosures and being able to bring a resolution to some of these nuisance properties. Additionally, we've seen support from the Public Works Director and interdepartmental support. We've been able to tap into some nuisance abatement funding to go out and clean up some of these nuisance properties. We've recently did that on the coast in a very successful example, and we are preparing to do that with the property in Dexter, the Castro property, which I know Commissioner Buck is familiar with. This is, and I have a picture of it in the presentation I can show later on. This is a property that's been in disrepair for a number of years. It has a number of, junked RVs and other things on it. The county is now, within the next couple of days, will be the proud owner of that property, and then we'll be on the hook to clean it up. We do have funding through our nuisance abatement program to work on that property. There's also a number of proactive measures that we've been trying to roll out. So getting to that preventative measure, compliance staff for the first time, I think in a number of years, have gone out to a community to talk about the program, talk about the things that are regulated, and to explain to the public, concerned neighbors, how they can file effective complaints and what sort of evidence we need to move forward, kind of walk through the process with the public. We're also doing a mailing in the fall that will, in the spring, that will describe one of the issues that we see a lot and explain it to the public, and that's those riparian violations. So we intend on doing a mail out to landowners in riparian areas to explain to them what the current codes are, because a lot of it is just ignorance of the code. We think a lot of people, while there may be bad actors who, commit these violations, a number of folks may just be unaware of the regulations in place. So we're trying to be more proactive and do some outreach to the public. And then another positive thing, while not entirely positive, we do have 2 FTE right now, which is better than 1, which is what we had for a number of years. It's still woefully insufficient for the number of violations that we see, but we do have 2 FTE, although one of those positions is currently vacant. We've had an internal promotion. We are in the process of filling it right now, so we're, with 1 FTE. And then finally, we have some exceptional staff. We're lucky enough to have Jane Burgess, who is the county code enforcement officer for the last 20 years or so. She's back with us working in a 520 capacity. She's been terrific, providing a lot of expertise and training to newer staff. And of course, Cheryl Lockhart, who's been with the county for a number of years. She's a very experienced code enforcement officer. I know she works a lot with board members. So we are lucky to have some really talented and professional staff. So those are some of the positives. Now we'll talk about the challenges that we have. The first one with code enforcement, which I don't think can be overlooked, is sort of the human element involved. There is all of these cases, there's a root cause behind them, and oftentimes, it's an individual. And what we're learning is what's driving a lot of these compliance issues are behavioral concerns, be it mental health or hoarding, homelessness, and criminal activity. All these things play a part. And we need to be sympathetic to those concerns. Homeless individuals are trying to get by, and oftentimes, they're going to do what they can to survive. If it's, contrary to land use regulations, we need to be cognizant of that and work with those individuals. A lot of our violators are chronic and uncooperative. Sometimes there's just a difference of opinions or a different, ideological viewpoint about government and regulations in general. So we often have a number of, aggressive, angry clients that staff deal with. A lot of times the individuals are, the delinquent landlords or out-of-state landlords. So there's hard to actually find somebody to pursue enforcement on. And of course, there's also a number of squatters that we deal with. Neighborhood disputes, the classic feuding neighbors, that's something that drives a lot of our complaints. It seems like individuals will just take one action and the neighbor takes another action and things just escalate. And that's unfortunate, but that drives a lot of our work. And then another concern is sort of the public perception. There's this fine balancing act, whether we're doing too much compliance, it's too heavy-handed, or it's not enough. There's these different viewpoints about what the county should be doing. And then the expectations, public expectations are that, if a complaint is filed, the county should be out there immediately taking care of it, and the process and the staff limitations often cause, some failed expectations with the public. Kind of talked about this a little bit, but just the range of duties. There's a number of different things that code compliance is tasked with addressing, building, zoning issues. And then another challenge is just the sheer geography and diversity of the county, from the coast to the Cascades, Florence to Mackenzie Bridge or Oak Ridge. Staff deal with urban issues, unincorporated communities, rural issues, and oftentimes very remote areas. So staff will be out doing enforcement actions, often alone in very remote parts of the county. So that's a concern as well. And of course, there are resource limitations, as I've already talked about. Staffing is not what it should be to address the volume of work that comes in. We have, a high volume of complaints. One thing that we believe happens is that a lack of effective enforcement breeds more violations. We hear this a lot from our customers who come in, who maybe they are being, there is an action against them, or they're being told they need a building permit. A common response is, well, the county doesn't enforce its own regulations, so I'm just going to go build this without a permit or fill in the blank. So we do think that happens when there isn't proper enforcement, more violations do occur, and it's just kind of a repeating cycle there. And then finally, while it's very positive that we now do have a budget for abatement properties, it's pretty small at this point. This is the fund that when properties are sold or there's fines and levies, we levy fines, we will eventually be repaying into this fund. There was $145,000 in that fund. The county just, as I mentioned, with the Castro property, we're now paying that, the bank off for that property, taking over ownership so we can abate it. But $105,000 does not go very far when you think that a property to remove a junked RV, it's about $2,000 per RV. So just with these 3 properties that you see photos of up there, that's over $100,000 right there. So with 3 properties, we could expend all of our abatement funds. So we need to be judicious and wise in how we use that. We need to use that funding appropriately to get the most bang for the buck for the community. And now these are the things that I want to talk about today. This is where, maybe we can find more resources. I don't think we can treat the human problem. That's, we're here to respond to the issues, and luckily we have other great county departments that can deal with mental health and those things. But the things that we can focus on are our processes and our policies. We can streamline our processes, we can have clean processes, we can be as efficient as possible with the limited resources that we have, and we can update our code. So, and these are all challenges that we have. I think as the board is aware, they've seen the frustration from customers who, neighbors who are dealing with a compliance issue that just lingers on and on and on, and the process that's in code right now is pretty lengthy. Enforcement oftentimes is difficult, especially for like riparian issues, for example. It's hard to enforce upon those violations because unless you're out there in the field really catching somebody in the act, it's difficult to do a post, forensic analysis of the whatever occurred, the environmental degradation that occurred in that area. We also have limited enforcement tools, and I think there are a number of things that we could augment our code with, which we discuss in the packet, and which we'll talk about, that will provide us more opportunities to deal with some of these issues. And another thing is that our administrative civil penalties, the formula within the code hasn't been updated in, nearly 20 years. So the fines haven't really grown with, the cost of living. While some would say they're still high, others would say they're still pretty low. When you think about the fining process, oftentimes individuals who want to act and they want to clean up their property, they'll be able to do so without incurring any fines. But it's those absentee landlords or, folks who live out of state or individuals who just don't have any interest in cleaning up a property. It's with those individuals that having effective fines is really critical, because the faster fines can assess, we can reach that threshold to foreclose upon those properties. And ultimately, that's how a number of these issues are resolved, is through foreclosure, unfortunately. And you need to meet a minimum threshold of $40,000 in assessed fines or liens before you can foreclose on a property.
140, Kara, sorry?
40,000.
40,000.
Yeah. So now I kind of want to dig into the meat of the presentation, talk about some of the code enhancement options which are described in the packet. The first big one is to try to streamline the process. The administrative civil penalty process laid out in the code is pretty lengthy. So this is sort of kind of a step-by-step. There's also a diagram as one of your attachments. I'll run through it really quickly. Staff will receive a complaint, we'll do an investigation, gather information. If we find that there's a valid violation, we'll send out what's called a request for voluntary correction letter. That's basically a polite letter that asks people to come into compliance with the code. It doesn't typically have any kind of language in there about fees or fines, although it says that you will progress to the next step in the enforcement process if there's not, action taken. If no action occurs, which in most cases we don't see any sort of action occur with that first letter, it has to get to the second step, which is the order to comply. Again, this is just another letter, but this letter provides a deadline for action to occur. And if action doesn't occur after that time, we notify the individual that fines could start to be assessed on the property. This letter is what gets about 75% of the complaints resolved. So once this letter goes out, it is effective in resolving a great number of complaints. And folks, no fines are assessed and the process works. Then we go to the notice of failure to comply. We assess fines. There's an appeal period. If it's appealed, there's a hearing before our hearings official. Then an order of civil penalty is issued. And once fines continue to assess, we can file a lien after 60 days. Ultimately, if there is a high enough lien against the property and the county chooses to foreclose, which we often don't for different financial reasons and resource reasons, the property owner has a right of redemption. So there's a period of time where they have an opportunity to resolve the issue. So again, this is more time built into this overall process. It can stretch out for months or years. So to cut to the quick, what staff is recommending is that we do away with that first step in the compliance process, and that's that request for voluntary compliance. And while it may seem like a minor step, that it's only going to shave 30 days off of this whole process, what it also does is it makes staff much more efficient. It reduces one more step, one more mailing. It helps us maximize the limited staff resources that we have. Where we're more productive, we send out the letter that's actually affects change, and it can help staff be, it's more of a force multiplier, helps staff be more effective. So that's one proposal. This diagram basically shows what would occur. We'd be taking out those steps that are in the red, the request for voluntary correction step, to streamline that process. It would end up looking more like that process. And again, as you can see, as outlined here, the notice of failure to comply, this is really where the majority of cases are resolved. Though I do want to mention that those sort of very high-profile cases that the board is familiar with, the ones that it's a nuisance property, it's blighted, and the neighborhood has a lot of concerns about it, we estimate that that's probably only about 2 to 3% of all complaints that occur. It's a very small subsection, but it does suck a lot of staff resources, and it's a high impact on the community. So even though it's a small overall percentage of cases, it is something that we prioritize. Another issue that we've proposed is that we look into the possibility of augmenting our administrative civil penalty process with the ability to issue citations in certain limited instances. There are some cases where the ability to issue a citation could be advantageous. This is true in those cases where it's not necessarily the landowner who is in violation. Sometimes it's a kind of a one and done operation where somebody moves onto a property. We've seen this, for instance, somebody will drive a backhoe across the river and do a bunch of work on their neighbor's property to prevent erosion on their side of the property. They're actually impacting their neighbor, and our only recourse to deal with that is to fine the neighbor for allowing, which they didn't allow, the neighbor to come across and mess with their property. So the ability to issue a citation to the actual violator seems like a logical tool to have. Again, things like, things with a big environmental impact. One such case is with mining operations. This is an example of a mining operation close to town where there was an area of the mine that was permitted through the state, through Dogami, and through the county, through special use permits. It was very clear where the allowable mining area was. And the issue with this is that, after a number of years, we think the majority of the approved mine was dug out, and then illegal mining started occurring on resource land right next to it. This is up on a mountainside. It was out of public view. In this instance, we weren't able to take any meaningful enforcement actions against the individuals because basically once they were caught, they ceased operation. And the way our code works is that you're assessed a fine for each day that the violation is occurring. Well, if they've ceased operations and they say that they're going to mitigate or remediate the site, there's really no deterrent there. And the concern there is not to be punitive against the individuals, but it's if that is the view in the county that, well, geez, I can operate outside of my approved mining area and the county doesn't issue any kind of a fine against me, there's sort of a perverse incentive there that we want to prevent. So in addition to the citations and the administrative enforcement process, we've also been looking into the opportunity to seek a civil search warrant. So right now, when we want to abate a property, if there's a, dangerous building that for whatever reason we're having a difficult time accessing the property, the owners won't give us permission. County council is advised against going on the property. It's posted no trespassing. It can take up to 3 months to get a court order to actually get onto that property to, do some sort of an abatement, and that is very time consuming. That's, an impact to the neighborhood and can be problematic. So what we hope to be able to do is to look into the option where county council can go seek a civil search warrant. Those can be issued within a couple of days. There are some examples of that that we found where that is an option. Again, obviously there's some, concerns there. We want to be respectful of people's private property rights and their ability, to not have these spurious search and seizure of their property. So that's a concern. I mentioned the adjustments in the administrative enforcement penalty process. We could look at increases in the fine amounts. And then there's a number of other smaller updates that staff has identified, updates in definitions, things that we're currently not regulating, like light trespass, which is an issue with marijuana grows, garbage containment. We see a lot of waste and vermin and things like that. We don't have standards for, proper containment of garbage. And then one thing that's interesting is I mentioned that right of redemption period. This isn't mentioned in the board packet, but I just came across this, I think in Washington County's code. They've actually written in a process where they can reduce that right of redemption period where it's clear that the owner has no longer expressed an interest in the property. They're not engaged in the process. The property is abandoned. Nobody's living there. Where it looks like that county is able to cut that redemption period down to shave some more time off of the clock so we can find faster resolution of some of these issues. As far as programmatic improvements, we're doing a number of things. We're working with the county's new Tableau software to develop some key performance indicators for the program. One of the challenges I found coming into this program was there was a real lack of data about certain things like number of violations, types of violations. We have some of that information, but really digging down the details, some of that is lacking, and we could do a better job, I think, with just the lack of staff resources over the years. Tracking information like that hasn't always been a high priority. So definitely working with technology services with our Tableau software to develop some performance indicators to track and see how we need to move forward, how to improve the program. We want to continue those community outreach projects like I talked about, get into more neighborhoods, kind of explain the code compliance process to the community. I'm very concerned about officer safety. As I mentioned, our code compliance officers They do a dangerous job. It's not as dangerous as, sworn police officers, but they're unarmed. They go out in the community, often dealing with, mentally ill, aggressive individuals acting alone in rural parts of the county. We're looking to implement some officer safety training. We want to increase the use of technology, which again, there's a lot of bang for the buck there, being able to buy new aerial photo coverage. That's a huge tool that we use at the county. We've been receiving drone photos from neighbors showing, properties that are out of violation that we can't normally see from the road. So this sort of technology is making our program more efficient and more effective. Next, we're looking at possible enhancements in terms of branding. Right now, it's the code compliance program. A number of other similar agencies around the state are known as a code enforcement program. They take a more proactive approach. My interest isn't to see our code enforcement staff turn into land use police or anything like that, but I do want to see them be maybe more visible, have a more forward-leaning and visible footprint in the community, so individuals are aware that the county does enforce its regulations. So looking into some possible improvements there. And then finally, we're very interested in exploring additional funding options, because obviously the program does have some resource limitations. One of the possible things that staff will likely be bringing to the Finance and Audit Committee is exploring our code compliance surcharge. We currently don't have a surcharge on building permits to fund code compliance. It's funded right now through different mechanisms, a little bit of our administrative surcharge, as well as some support from waste management. This could be an option that we'd like to investigate further. So, just a few observations before I wrap it up here. As I mentioned, those really visible, what's driving this work session for the board, I know, was a lot of those really visible, highly problematic properties. I do want to, again, stress that that is a very small percentage of the overall complaints that we get, but it is a visible concern that staff does focus on. We're trying to find tools to address those situations, but oftentimes when you have an unwilling landowner who's just not going to take any steps necessary to resolve the problem, you have limited funding for abatement, those can be challenging. Because of the historic lack of staffing resources, there is a high caseload. Our code enforcement officers each have over 100 open cases on their desk. More ones are coming in daily, so there's a high caseload. I will highlight the fact that a lot of the cases do get resolved quickly. That code enforcement process does work for a number of cases. 75% get resolved in a month or two. And then finally, in really taking kind of a deep dive into this program and trying to understand what we can do to improve it, I've come to the conclusion that there isn't one tool, there is no silver bullet that can fix some of these issues. It's a combination of these programmatic improvements that we've identified, some of these policy changes, and likely other things that we haven't yet identified. We're just kind of on the cusp of this sort of deep dive into the code, and there's likely going to be new ideas that come out as part of that process. So next steps, as I mentioned, we're kind of in the middle of doing some of those programmatic improvements. We're just opening up the option of updates to Lane Code Chapter 5. That's what we'll be asking the board for feedback on. We will be working, we have funding to work with a consultant on actually our current hearings official that deals with enforcement infractions, very familiar with the code enforcement code, will be assisting with a review of the code. And then we'll be investigating funding options. So right now, really what staff is hoping for is direction on two items. The first being those priorities that I discussed at the beginning. Are those priorities reflective of the board's priorities? And should we continue to move forward with those potential updates to Lane Code Chapter 5 that I discussed earlier? So I'm a little bit over time, so I'll leave it there for questions.
Commissioner Sorensen.
Hey, thanks so much, Mr. Miller. About 20 years ago, the board established a task force. I think you were starting in at that level, maybe a staff level at LMD. The board appointed Commissioner Morrison and myself to and outside people to come up with a kind of enforcement or improvement to all this. And so at the outset, I would say this is really great. The staff work you've done here, really good, phenomenal effort. And I really would summarize this by saying there are 3 words that come to mind. Full speed ahead. I like all of what you're talking about. Couple of things that I would, to answer your first question, does the board, and of course, usually the board doesn't really speak in unison. Usually there's 5 of us with 5 different ideas. But my idea is, number one, to answer your question, yes, I do favor these priorities. And secondly, I do favor your approaches. I do want to kind of mention a couple things. One is on enforcement. I think that although the high priority items are, small in terms of numbers, 2 to 3%, I think was your number, I think that they are oftentimes just seemingly never ending. And so I think the enforcement tool has to be streamlined and has to ramp up. But with that, I think comes a requirement on the part of government to have objective standards. And, we get calls all the time, hey, there's a whole bunch of junk over there. Well, I don't know if they're describing my former teenager's room or if they're describing a health hazard. And I think that we could look at things like the children's enforcement standards for the state of Oregon to remove a child from a house. They have objective standards. You don't remove a child from a house where someone hasn't dusted in a week, although my mother, now departed, probably would call that a standard that she would not approve of if it was violated. But I think that we need to really zero in on objective standards, health and safety, health and safety of animals, health and safety of children, health and safety of mentally ill or elderly people that are otherwise easily capable of being victimized. And I think that all of that goes into objective standards. And then for this first round of comments, I would also end by saying there's 2 things that are kind of on my mind in terms of the money to do more. One is when the board established waste management fees, you mentioned that as a tool we already have, but I think we ought to be looking at increasing that amount so that we can do more with the enforcement. And last but not least, I would say that, with our nation's most important laws, such as, say, the Civil Rights Act, discrimination on the basis of race, we don't just turn to government for enforcement. There's a third-party enforcement. Similarly, with our public health laws, most notably the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, we don't rely entirely on government to enforce those things. We allow third-party enforcement of those things. And by the way, it's limited. It's third-party enforcement after notice to government, that government, because it doesn't have the resources to deal with all violations. So I really think that we're missing something here in terms of providing for third-party enforcement, particularly when we do lack the resources and we have to prioritize things. I think that maybe having a third-party enforcement idea would cover that and improve that. So those are my initial comments. And once again, I'd like to conclude by just saying thank you so much for pushing this ball down the field.
Commissioner Farr.
Thank you, Chair Buck. Commissioner Sorensen, I'm pleased that you agree with the court enforcement priorities since you signed the order in 2003 that codified them.
Yep.
I've be alarmed if you didn't. Kira, I have a couple of questions about where and when. How does urban growth boundary or city limits affect the county's code enforcement responsibilities and possibilities?
It gets kind of complex. So the city enforces its own codes within the city limits, Eugene and Springfield. But outside in that urban growth area between the city limits and the urban growth boundary, county staff are responsible for some of the enforcement efforts. Not all. The city has authority over, building code violations and things like that. But some of the nuisance violations, county staff are responsible for enforcing those issues. Waste, garbage, as I mentioned, the vegetation, that sort of thing.
So, and that really is my area of greatest question, is the area inside the urban growth boundary that's outside of city limits, called the urban transition is what we generally refer to it as. And when I think about the complaints that I hear about code violations, it's usually not the neighbor. It's usually the somebody who is using land either illegally or on an impromptu basis. So I'm going to quote you. You said, and I quote, you said, we need to be sensitive to code violations that involve people who are homeless. Of course we do. Because typically the code violations that we see surrounding unsanctioned camps or even sanctioned camps are based upon an inability to store the products that are strewn around in some cases, and so people have possessions that they're not able to keep inside of their limits. So we see this quite often in the urban transition, and when we see it downtown, it becomes pretty evident. But I guess my question is, we have a circuit court decision from Idaho that does not allow us to interfere, basically, with the people who are camping on public property, unless we have an adequate place for them to move to, unless we have that to offer. So if a code violation, a clear, obvious code violation is occurring on public property, can you step through the process there?
Well, Commissioner Farr, a couple of things. We don't typically, we've yet to encounter this situation, obviously, and we wouldn't respond to a land use violation like that inside the urban transition area where there's homelessness on a property. That would fall within the city's purview. As far as the complaint on a public property, so we are typically complaint-driven. It's typically neighbors, requesting that the county resolve an issue with a neighboring property. If it was one of our properties that we owned, and it was in rural Lane County where we had authority over the situation, again, that doesn't happen a lot. There's not a lot of homeless encampments out, in rural parts of the county. They tend to be in closer where there's more services. If that was a land use violation, I would need to look into that Idaho case that you mentioned more. I'm not super familiar with it because we haven't dealt with that issue specifically, but I'd imagine with all the board interest as well, there would be a policy discussion about that when it came up.
Okay. So if there is a code violation on county land inside the urban growth boundary, inside of the city limits, that somebody's camping or using, let's say they're just using, not necessarily camping, county land, and they're dumping stuff, how do you go about complaining to the county when it's your county? Can you explain that process, or has that happened recently?
Sure. I mean, there's been instances where there might be, garbage dumping on county property. In that case, I mean, we're not going to assess fines against ourselves. We're going to clean up the property. So, I mean,
you won't go past step one in that situation.
Right. Yeah.
That makes a great deal of sense. The reason I'm pursuing that is because we do increasingly see people who are, through conditions, are camping in unsanctioned camps. We don't have enough sanctioned camps. We don't have enough places for people to stay legally. Consequently, there are many people who would prefer to stay in legal places who are forced to stay places that aren't legal or sanctioned. And that's where we tend to see what appear to the general public driving by as code violations. And we hear about that quite frequently. So, and Ms. Mokrowski, the reason I'm pursuing this is because we are actively now pursuing low barrier shelter and siting for low barrier shelter. And as we move forward with that siting, we have to bear in mind that that by slowing down our acquisition or determination which lands we can allow people to camp on legally, then we're really stepping on the toes of our code enforcement. We're not code enforcement, what are we called?
Code compliance.
Code compliance. Code enforcement is, did you say Washington County?
Well, a number of counties use that term.
Number of counties use that. So, so it's, you know, it is another reason for us to move more rapidly on finding places for people to legally camp and finding places for people to live in non-camping situations. Now, that brings up the protest camps. And, you know, you said that most of the camping does occur inside of the urban growth boundaries or inside of the city limits. And I think that Commissioner Buck would disagree a little bit because up around our reservoirs, there are many impromptu camps. Some have been quite established. And the only time we hear about it is when somebody complains. So I'm really not asking you for an answer right now, just flagging the situation that we increasingly have more people who are forced to live either off the grid or outside of what are sanctioned living environments, and it becomes an issue for everyone else. So it really redoubles our urgency in establishing places for people to live and people to stay. One final question, Chair, if I may, and that is regarding the priorities. The first one, there's a kind of a catch-all at the very end of that, or the environment. Isn't that just about anything?
It could be, but specifically what that's intended to address, and there are lists of specific examples under those priorities in the packet. Those are things like, you know, riparian violations, maybe violations within a coastal resource zone, something that has a significant impact on but yeah, I mean, a failing septic system on a property is, you know, if left untreated long enough, is an environmental impact as well. So Absolutely. You're right.
Thank you. And then I do have one last question, and that is regarding parking violations, parking code violations. Where does your department fit on that one?
We have very limited parking regulations. Oftentimes they're tied to a special use permit where there will be conditions of approval put on an application about parking requirements. I know there's some parking issues in your district. We don't typically run into those sort of issues, especially with, if you think about the just density, you know, those sort of larger developments that cause those parking concerns. We don't see too many of those in rural Linn County.
And I know that you are aware of them because you've heard from me and other people regarding that. So, which really becomes an issue if somebody parks a derelict vehicle and all of a sudden it's leaking oil and it's been sitting there for 6 months, and it becomes an urgent environmental concern as well, at which point we still leave the vehicle sitting there. So, once again, I don't have an answer, don't have a prescription, but it's something that we need to be aware of because it is a situation that we have that repeats itself. Thanks, Chair. Thanks for all the hard work.
Commissioner Brozovich.
Thank you. I'd like to refocus on what Land Management Division's actual responsibility is, which is the enforcement of our code on private property, not in public right-of-ways or public property. I do support your recommendations on both the guiding principles and your concepts for revisions, with the caveat that, you know, as we're trying to protect public health and safety, we need to balance private property rights and due process in it. I don't believe eliminating the request for voluntary compliance step will violate anyone's due process. I think you're headed in the right direction there. You know, it's interesting that, you know, we're at this point. You know, it's difficult to ask somebody to comply with something as simple as getting a building permit for a carport when they drive past something like Swamp Creek Farm on their way to the coast every other week or something like that. A situation that has actually been in compliance action since the 90s. That leads to this, you know, relative lawlessness when it comes to code compliance. And, you know, it acts like, quote, the broken window. that lawlessness is connected to a lot. Part of it's due to mental health issues. Part of it's driven by addiction. I know of a couple compliance sites where the folks camping there were originally invited on by an addicted heir or somebody else that had temporary control of the property to collect rent, in some way from them to feed their addictions. And next thing you know, we've got 10 or 12 RVs on a property with medically fragile homeless people that are actually in a situation of abuse in some ways by the actual property person, and very difficult to reach and help those folks out in rural areas. I've been trying to help with a property north of Junction City recently and tried to get St. Vincent's involved, and when St. Vincent's stopped by, no one came out to talk to them, so they kind of left the site and didn't further engage. It was kind of a sad situation. But those folks out there feel stranded. Their RVs are broken down, they can't move, they're trapped on the site. The site's full of rats and garbage. It's an environmental hazard, and we need to have better ways of dealing with this. But it all gets back to, we cut off our land management division from our general fund. We cut it off because we lost timber money. We are the only governmental organization I know of that is not, at least in some way, subsidizing our permit and planning departments with general fund revenues. The city of Florence subsidizes theirs. I think 60% of their building permit department is general fund money, not permit-driven, fee-driven. So as we start talking about things like increasing fines and increasing tipping fees and permits and all that stuff, at the same time, we've got a state that's talking about the issue of bail reform and how fines, fees, and all that disproportionately impact low-income people. We really ought to be talking about reestablishing that revenue source that used to be able to give us the ability to enforce these things, used to be able to have our full compliance section staffed. We used to be able to offer permits at a reasonable cost so we could have the housing in our county. So, as we talk about this, I fully support where we're going, because my district's full of these cases, and they do act like that broken window. It's pretty hard for me to lecture somebody about a minor code compliance issue when they're driving past Swamp Creek Farm every day. And next time you go to the coast, take a quick look to the right when you go by Poodle Creek Road. That's Swamp Creek Farm. And a lot of those sites are not only issues about environmental code compliance issues, they usually harbor criminals too. Most of the petty theft that's happening in some of the neighborhoods around these sites is happening from people living on these sites. So they're not only a code compliance issue, they're a public safety and quality of life issue for everybody that lives within distance of them. I'm on the Veneta Crime Watch, and every time one of the cons leaves that site, with a with their little, kit to steal gas, it goes up on the Crime Watch site. So-and-so just, left the site, and they've got their siphon and gas can. Keep an eye out. Yet that's one of our that particular property has been in code compliance for a long time, but everybody that lives anywhere near that property is dealing with that. Not to mention the people that are next door neighbors and dealing with that. So it's a bad situation. We need to find a way to better fund this. We need to find a way to resolve this. It's not just about providing extra camping sites. It's about providing a revenue stream for this program, other than just trying to ask people for more money for permits, because all we do is then constrain the supply of housing and really frustrate a lot of folks that are just trying to do something right out there.
Commissioner Burney?
First, generally, I also support the enhancements that you've articulated. I agree with, well, won't get into that. I think that, did you say it's been 20 years since certain fines or fees were changed?
As far as I could tell, it's been about 18 years, yeah. 2002, I believe, is when.
Well, I would suggest when you look at the specific amount, it simply be consistent with the increase in the consumer price index. So no one can, so it's not arbitrary, that's all.
I appreciate that. I will just clarify that, last year staff went through a CPI-based adjustment to our permit fees. So that didn't impact fines, and it didn't specifically address code compliance, although we do get, I want to just be clear that we do see an administrative surcharge applied to all of our building permits. Some of that administrative surcharge feeds in a compliance program, but again, it's a small amount, but appreciate the clarification.
No, I appreciate the clarification. I agree that it does seem as if, it's interesting. It's interesting that this is the second discussion this board has had today where a system is somewhat of an enterprise system. It has to generate its own resources, which means that you're trying to pay for a system that you say that is complaint driven, and yet we don't have the enforcement resources to respond to complaints. So again, it seems a bit somehow systemically imbalanced, which is, I think, what you were speaking to, or part of it. I also want to share that it's no small feat that a gentleman named Robert Spencer provided input this morning saying he absolutely supported and agreed with the direction that you were going on this, in that my first meetings with him is he was complaining. and I think that being responsive is wonderful. I think he stated, I'm not quoting, but I think it related to, I support this. I'm not saying it goes far enough, but I support the direction that you're going. So kudos to you for that. And finally, I personally want to dispel a myth that isn't being articulated but implied. And I may be wrong, but my understanding is that no action this board has taken has impacted the amount of timber receipts that we are receiving currently. We're receiving our share. I was at BLM a month ago. They're actually mandated to do more cuts, but they don't have the staff capacity to respond to the mandates. So I agree, and I think this relates to one of your points, we need to develop alternative sources of revenue. I'm not presuming you haven't looked into this, but there are also a variety of youth corps type groups that perhaps could be engaged as appropriate in partnerships to extend reach a little bit, at least in terms of reporting or documenting, and giving young people, getting them out into the country a little bit. But all in all, I want to provide my support for the direction that you're taking this. Thank you.
Commissioner Sorensen.
Every once in a while, and maybe this is apropos for the next discussion as well, we hear about one English economist, Arthur Pigou, and I don't know how many of you have ever heard of him, but the Pigouvian analysis is that if you tax things that are bad, you will, if the tax is appropriately priced, you will drive the market to not do the bad thing, but do the good thing for society. So it's commonly used in the area of speeding tickets. If you give someone a speeding ticket and it's sufficiently high, then they won't do it again because that is a cost that they have, and there's some kind of externality to society. We don't want people dying on our roads or killing other people, at least, on our roads. So it's used a lot in the pollution arena so that people who are doing something that could be costly to society in terms of the damage to the environment, well, you increase the tax or penalty that they're paying. So in this situation, we want an incentive for people to comply with the rules. And what's happened, I think, and it's actually way beyond Lane County's transition from a timber-dependent government to a non-timber dependent government, which we've been forced or wanted to move in the direction of less dependency on the federal forest dollars, maybe $100 million in 1977, pretty big chunk of money. Now we're down to about $6 million. So we've largely gotten rid of our timber dependency, but it seems to me that we could, with this whole effort that you're making, whether it's fees or fines, we could get people into compliance. And if they don't want to be in compliance, we're not taking anybody's resources other than land. The land is what is the valuable part of this. And so we're not taking someone's income, we're taking someone's land when they don't pay their fines and fees, and they just blow us off for years and years at a time. So to me, increasing that will send a message, because I think what sent a message has been, Lane County doesn't have the resources and they won't go after you. So you can pretty much do anything you want. And the kind of grotesque photos that were shown in executive session, which is way beyond anything you've chosen to show today, say whatever we're doing, we're not doing enough, and that you're pushing in the right direction. But I think that the days of, of the board saying, hey, look, please, we just want you to comply and send a nice letter that's not complied with, that doesn't, seems to me we need to move into a more direct relationship with people and be direct about what the consequences are, and put the notice fairly direct. Your property rights will be taken unless you're brought into compliance, so that it's clear that we're not going to surprise somebody at the end by having a big governmental tax lien or some other kind of lien that can more easily be acted upon. And it's just really been frustrating to hear these stories over the years. And I also want to second Commissioner Burney mentioned, and that is, if we had the resources, we could then go out on a contract with maybe Northwest Youth Corps or some other organization and say, hey, we've got some cleanup work that's not hazardous waste, that's not dangerous, but it's still a nuisance that can be cleaned up. But remember, we have to take title of that property first. And to do that, we've got to be direct with people that they could do it cheaper, they could retain what property rights they have. But if they don't, then we're going to do that. And think of all the constituents of the urban members on the board, the metro, as our charter calls us, the commissioners representing North Eugene, South Eugene, and Springfield. Our constituents drive through these rural areas, they see this, and they are shocked. They are shocked when they see this stuff. Our rural counterparts, they live with all of the neighbors calling, what can you do, what can you do? So I just think we ought to get beyond this idea of start with voluntary compliance. That's what everyone should know. I think we start with a slow but increasing level of severity for the violations that are out there. And I think good people will try to comply. And if there is a hardship case, maybe there should be an exemption for that, economic hardship. But it's got to be applied for, and it's got to be real. And we've had people come in here from trusts and other more complicated land ownerships, and it's very clear that they had the resources to do it. They had the resources to clean it up, and they just didn't want to do it.
Well, I think overall you've got a consensus of support on your ideas. I as well support that. I would venture to say our two rural districts get the most contact with your department in this regard. I mean, there is just a sense that people move out into rural areas to get away from government and people and want to be out on their own and get a sense of being able to do whatever they darn well like out there, to the detriment sometimes in these cases to the rest of the community. And I understand the freedom of that, but at the same time, everybody has their duty to be responsible to the rest of their community. I would be interested, I'm guessing that you will probably come back with some more information on this later. If, I should say when you do, it would be very interesting to see what some of our comparative counties do. I know each and every county is absolutely unique, but we have our 5 comparator counties, and it would just be good information to know with not a lot of excessive research.
And could I clarify, and when you say what they do you mean in terms of the process and also the fines that they levy?
Yeah, this department that they may have, maybe they don't have it, but I would think that many would. And then how do they run it in some of our key areas? How much money they provide for them, how many employees do they usually have in their department, that kind of thing. Commissioner Farr.
Chair Buck, you and I are 2/3 of the Finance and Audit Committee, and Keir mentioned that there may be an item coming before the Finance and Audit Committee in the near future regarding funding of the Compliance Division, and so we'll be looking forward to that. The only other thing I'll say is, code standards are code standards no matter whose property it is, whether it's private property or public property. And when private individuals are affecting the code standards on public property, it's the business whoever drives by and encounters it. So thank you for the work you do.
Any other comments? All right, thank you, Mr. Miller.
Thanks.
We'll move on to item B, which is an order/resolution number 20-02-04-04 in the matter of establishing a climate change strategy for Lane County. And with us is Dan Hurley, Director of our Public Works. Welcome.
Thank you, Chair Buck. Good afternoon, Commissioners. So I'm here to continue our conversation on climate resolution. We started this back in August, and then most recently, December 10th, revisited the conversation. And at that time, I provided 4 example resolutions for your consideration. There were a couple from Alameda County. One was highly detailed with very specific targets and actions. The other one was more streamlined, of more of a leadership strategy. I also shared a couple examples from larger entities. One was the U.S. Cool Counties Declaration, which has gotten somewhat dated. Also, the Declaration on Human Rights and Climate Change by the Global Network for the Study of Human Rights and the Environment. So, based on that feedback on December 10th, we developed a resolution for your consideration, which is in your packet. And it's based on the Alameda leadership strategy example. And in it, there are 6 specific actions, and I'll take you through those. The first one is to conduct a greenhouse gas emissions inventory, and that work is already underway. We are working through our first phase of the Climate Action Plan to develop our internal plan, and I'll have an update for you on that in April. The second piece is to develop a comprehensive county-wide plan. That would be phase 2, as we've talked about it before, to establish county-wide community targets and high-priority areas for action. And we anticipate beginning that work this summer. The third one is to develop a resiliency plan. This is a more recent addition to what we envisioned for the Climate Action Plan and was recommended by Beyond Toxics and the NAACP when we met with them a couple months ago. The fourth is to develop action initiatives supporting green jobs, clean energy projects, and climate-friendly industries in Lane County. That was specifically requested by Commissioner Burney at our last work session. And I will be returning on March 31st with Josh Proudfoot, who's the consultant we retained from Good Company that's working on our Climate Action Plan. So we'll talk about that one specifically at that meeting. The fifth is to provide open and transparent public communications to monitor and evaluate progress toward our climate action goals. We think this will be important as we move through this work, and we've already started talking with our PIO to set up a website to launch that part of it. The sixth part is to establish a climate advisory committee, and if the board endorses this resolution today, we'd be returning at a later date to bring more specifics about what that would look like as we step that up. So getting into the resolution, if you take a look at it there, the first paragraph is just to acknowledge that climate change presents real risks that threaten the long-term human health, environmental health, social well-being, and economic vitality of the community. The second paragraph there is to acknowledge the strong science behind climate change at this point. I've added a couple quotations from the 4th National Climate Assessment. This is the most significant body of climate science to date. Between volumes 1 and 2, it comprises almost 2,000 pages, but I've included just the executive summary in your packet today and pulled out a couple quotations. One is that we are living in the warmest period in the history of modern civilization, and that based on extensive evidence that it is extremely likely that human activities, especially emissions of greenhouse gases, are the dominant cause of observed warming. The third paragraph there is to note that some of the physical consequences of climate change, and to note that these are already evident and occurring. The fourth is to acknowledge that rural and marginalized populations are disproportionately affected, also key to young people and future generations. And the last one there before the specific actions is to note that that Lane County has been doing environmental work for some time. This isn't the beginning of this work, but we're committed to adopting new strategies to confront the significance of climate change. At the end of the 6 actions I've already discussed, there's an acknowledgement there of the Declaration of Human Rights and Climate Change that I discussed earlier, and that was a previous example. As an importance of acknowledging the important equity component of this work. So that is the resolution. It's largely symbolic, of course. It doesn't bind the board or future boards, but it does send an important message to the community that Lane County is committed to doing what we can that is within our control to address our part of this global environmental crisis. In the packet, in the memo, I've given you 4 options. One would be to adopt the resolution in order as written. The second is to direct staff to revise this and possibly develop specific targets. The third would be to adopt or endorse a resolution from another entity, and I provided 2 examples previously. And the fourth would be to postpone a resolution until we're further along with our climate action plan and have specific targets in mind. The staff recommendation is to adopt as written, but at this point I'm open to your feedback.
Thank you. Any comments? Questions? Well, I will start out at least and then I'll get you, just to acknowledge that this definitely incorporated everything that we were talking about at our last meeting regarding this, and thank you for being able to put it in something concise. I'm a strong proponent of the resolution as it's written, and would encourage fellow board members to approve the order. Commissioner Sorensen.
I also agree with the proposal that's in terms of your recommendation. And so just to kick this off, I'll move approval.
Got a motion to move approval. Is there a second?
Second.
And I'll just say that today isn't the day that I'd like to formulate this, but I do think that we ought to move beyond the direction to approve this order, and we ought to think about, I don't know how to do that. That's part of what will be a part of this interactive process of the department that's tasked to head this up, the consultant, and the Board of Commissioners. But I would like to move to, at some point, both have it be external to county government, not just internal to county government, and also to have it in some degree of enforceability, either an ordinance or some other mechanism by which the public sees that we are being held to a standard that we're establishing, and not something that is just a board order that can be revoked at any public meeting where the board is meeting. So that would be my hope down the road. But I do think that today the focus should be on moving forward with something tangible, such as the proposal you have. Thanks.
Just to clarify, your motion was the one that we have in front of us today, and when you mentioned a future motion, that will be something you might do down the line and not part of your.
Yeah, that's what I meant, exactly, thank you.
Move toward.
Yeah.
Move toward. Okay. Anybody else? Commissioner Bozovich.
So I have expressed my concerns about us stepping into this issue at all, and believe it's not really a matter of county concern, not something we can have significant impact on. I believe it takes us away from things that we've all expressed much more concern and focus, whether it's dealing with our mental health crisis, dealing with our homeless, dealing with housing. But my real concern about today's board order is that it has attached to it a declaration on human rights that includes rights that are not rights and gives rights to inanimate objects and echoes language from the Community Rights Initiative, which would basically, if adopted and was actually made into code, as Commissioner Sorensen suggests, would provide the ability for people to sue third-party lawsuits on behalf of a potato or soil. So I would move to amend the current board order to delete the last paragraph of the resolution.
Is there a second? I don't see a second. Move to amend is failed. Any other discussion? Commissioner Farr?
Thank you. And I'm pointing out the fourth whereas, excuse me, 1, 2, 3, 4, fifth whereas Lane County has been committed to environmental stewardship by employing best practices in providing government services and acknowledges that the magnitude of the challenges posed by global climate change requires new strategies and leadership by government at all levels to take concrete action. I'd like to talk about that a little bit. How have we been committed to environmental stewardship? Can you talk about that a little bit? What have we done? Why can we say that?
We can say that we had a work session on this about 6 months ago where we talked about best practices, and Michael Johns was here, our fleet and general services manager. We talked about the work we've done around renewable fuels. We've done quite a bit of work around this issue in the field of solid waste and recycling. We have the highest recovery rate in the state. We're always looking for efficiencies in our buildings, use of energy. So we spoke about several of those at the work session. We have some members of our climate action team here, and they could probably speak to all the different areas within their specific divisions and departments, but those are a few of the highlights.
And I called that out last time. I asked you and Michael both to say that we have been doing, I'm not going to say doing our part, but we've been, as you say here, committed to environmental stewardship by employing best practices. Now, that's a pretty strong statement that we're employing best practices. Can we be sure that we are employing best practices?
To the best of our knowledge, we're always seeking best practices. In most of these areas, we communicate across the community and within the state and within trade organizations to seek out best practices and then employ those.
So we're seeking out best practices. We're passing a resolution here with very specific language that really has, we want to make certain that the wording of the resolution is accurate. And is it accurate that we are employing best practices?
I believe that is accurate, yes.
I believe that's accurate. Okay, good. Then another part of that says leadership by government at all levels to take concrete action. What's our part in leadership by government at all levels, other than our level?
That was to state that we can't just put this off as a global issue and expect someone global to take care of the issue. It's at local, state, federal levels. We all can take actions to reduce emissions and confront this issue.
So for folks who are watching, it requires new strategies and leadership by government at all levels. What are we going to do to ensure that beyond our level? New strategies by governments at all levels.
So we'll be working through that. That's our climate action plan. So the first phase of that will be looking at what are the things in direct control of county operations. Where can we reduce emissions through our actions? Where can we make our buildings more efficient? How can we change our solid waste practices so our landfill isn't emitting so much methane, for example? What can we do around our vehicles as we're trying to electrify the fleet and reduce fossil fuel emissions from our vehicles? So those would be the first things. And then moving into the second phase where we're talking with the community, addressing a broad set of goals of how we can reduce emissions through transportation, through land use practices, a variety of things.
And how we at our level, but we're not going to prescribe it to the government of other countries, for instance, or...
No, I'm anticipating that the most we would do beyond our level would be in an advocacy stance where we do lobbying to the state to try to get the state to take action, so that sort of thing.
And, you know, when we were passing tobacco ordinances, we were pioneering tobacco ordinances, and we weren't telling other governments to change their tobacco laws, but other governments did, and probably in no small part because of, or in some part because of actions that took place here in Lane County. So being bold and stepping forward with bold steps is something that we're accustomed to doing, and something that we're not adverse to doing by any stretch of the imagination. What concerns me is on a group of whereases. By passing this, we're acquiescing that the whereas is an accurate statement.
Correct.
And we believe that all of these whereases are completely accurate statements.
I do.
Okay. So we go to the therefores, to conduct a greenhouse gas emissions inventory and develop an internal plan. I'm curious to see as we do, and this is going to pass today, obviously. This will pass. As we conduct a greenhouse gas emissions inventory, are we going to compare that to other similar jurisdictions?
We will. The consultants we're working with, the company is called The Good Company, has done greenhouse gas emissions for communities across the state. They've recently they did the city of Eugene's and have updated these, and we will compare those. We will be bringing that to you in April, and we can show you how our emissions. I hope we'll be completed with that work and then be able to compare that to other communities.
Okay. And this resolution just calls for developing a resiliency plan and developing action initiatives. It doesn't say implement, it says develop. So as we develop, there'll be a great deal of input, a great deal of discussion as to the merits and the effectiveness of resiliency plans and action initiatives. Part of that
I'm anticipating we'll have regular check-ins on the Phase 2 and Phase 3 work to bring that work to the board, get feedback on it as we work to develop and then future to implement.
And are you going to be able to provide global impact on the actions we take? How does this affect the the overall global impact?
We can provide that. What is our share and what will these actions do to impact that?
I think people will be interested to see that because they'll be able to see what potentially we can do in our tiny, tiny little spot of the world. And really, does it have an impact that that merits the investment that is being placed in it? And when I say the investment, there's a cost involved. We will pay a price, and the price won't just be in staff time. It'll be in productivity time or productivity potentially. So, for instance, if a resiliency plan and action initiatives involve never cutting down another tree in the forest, for instance, or whatever reduction in cutting down trees, then there's an impact of that, and there's a cost of doing that. Now, so the determination, whenever you pay a cost, you need to make sure that the cost is offset by the return on what you pay. We're going to be able to measure that?
We will certainly be able to bring the costs, but I think it's also important to remember that there are costs of not taking action too, and these physical consequences that are already happening are a result of not taking action. So we can try to portray all sides of that.
Of course, and I think because of the many people who are going to be looking at this and the many people who are going to be judging our actions, I think we owe it to them to be able to recite what it is we've done and the full understanding that we have of what it is that we're doing and how it does impact the entire globe and how it does impact the kids trying to find their next meal who live down the street.
Commissioner Burney.
I'm going to try and be brief, but I may not succeed. First, before I start, I actually asked Commissioner Bozovich where in the human rights and climate change were items he mentioned. I looked, they are there. But this last paragraph, correct me if I'm wrong, it doesn't make us liable. It simply endorses the principles that document contains. Am I correct?
That's how I would read it. I would probably be good to get legal counsel's opinion if you feel that there's risk there.
I feel I absolutely endorse those principles, but I also feel it wouldn't hurt to approve this pending that, just because there are a lot of words in there I don't want to be liable for, even though I endorse what they are saying. I want to commend you. You originally were not necessarily going to bring this to us so soon, as I recall in our December discussion, and this does incorporate, as far as I can see, pretty much everything we talked about. So hats off to you, Mr. Hurley. I now want to, I also agree that, there are things in here like a community advisory group that it may not be appropriate yet. It may be almost more cumbersome, even though our intent is inclusivity. And you've already demonstrated that by reaching out to groups who historically have not been part of this discussion. So I like it as written. It gives you that flexibility, and it doesn't require you to do things that might not be the most cost-effective use of your time. When do you expect to have this hire in that's going to be actually shepherding this process?
We are making an offer today.
Oh, really? You didn't pay me to say that. Okay.
We had interviews last week. We interviewed several outstanding candidates. We were checking references yesterday and hope to make an offer today.
So I look forward in the discussion, probably with Mr. Proudfoot, of talking about things like how we best work with utility boards that have authorization to determine how to transition and measure their movement towards more and more renewable energy in their energy portfolios that they provide customers. I look for, and I believe someone's going to be doing that. I look forward to exploring, because in the process, doing that in a business and prudent way so that the impact is creating net new jobs, not looking at this as a cost that's not recovered. I look forward to actually, Commissioner Farr was talking during the courthouse, if I recall, sir, about talking about what would happen if we don't do this in terms of in rural communities, and I think that's equally applicable here. What would happen if we don't move forward with some of these mitigation kinds of efforts? I would like to share parenthetically that my brother-in-law is a geothermal engineer and develops geothermal renewable energy projects. He's developed them in every continent in the world other than Antarctica, and he has over 2,000 megawatts under his belt. And in all of his work, it is related to the security of the grids of the countries he's been working in. It relates to bringing up wages and creating jobs in the country he's working in. So there's ways to do this the right way. And I also look forward to talking to this board about how we can incent the creation of net zero and net zero plus buildings and facilities that create more clean energy than they use, and how we can, forgive me, but I'm just enthused, and how we can use battery storage to create virtual power plants so that in events where that's necessary, rather than looking at peaker plants, we can look at virtual peaker plants in a sense, because that is actually occurring. This is not like science fiction. This is truly happening. So in closing, I applaud your work. I would encourage us to move forward with this. and adopt option number 1, and we'll develop targets as it unfolds in an appropriate way. And I think you've created an excellent foundation. Thank you.
Commissioner Sorensen.
Thank you. Mr. Hurley, I just want to ask just a process question. In the board order, or the proposed board order, it's the last paragraph says, the Board of County Commissioners acknowledges the attached Declaration on Human Rights and Climate Change and endorses the principles contained therein. Just factually, that's a one-page attachment that starts with the terms Declaration on Human Rights and Climate Change, right?
Correct.
It doesn't include all of the background material from the U.S. Global Change Research Program.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. And the concern about whether something in those human rights declaration that it would be somehow enforceable. All the board order says is we acknowledge the attached Declaration of Human Rights and endorse the principles. Doesn't say it's enforceable. Doesn't say we are guided by them in our daily work, and if you can hold us to that and sue us or whatever. And also, isn't it fair to say that the Lane County Legal Counsel approves all items coming to the board through the agenda process? That's part of the compliance with Lane County's internal policies, is that budget personnel and legal personnel approve it before it goes to the agenda team.
That is true, Commissioner.
Yeah. Okay. And, I just think this is so good because, a lot of people have forgotten about the Stockholm Declaration of the United Nations Conference on the Human Environment. That's one of the parts of the preamble. I think Kyoto and Paris are a lot more famous, but I actually, as a college student, attended the Stockholm Conference myself. So, 1972. So, anyway.
Commissioner Bosevich.
Thank you. So first, I want to clarify, I never said it was going to be enforceable or make us liable by passing this.
I did.
Yeah. So please just be clear about that. What I did state was it's endorsing the concept of somebody other than an individual having rights. And in addition to that, it goes further in the document to endorse the idea of transfer of wealth and resources by the force of government in balancing impacts, et cetera. I mean, it basically has a lot in there that I just can't agree with, period. That's why I asked to have it pulled. And ultimately, if we get down the road of going, what I said was if we go beyond, which was what Commissioner Sorensen was talking about, was next steps of making this parts of our code. I sure as heck hope this doesn't become part of our code, because then it would open up that issue. It was one of my biggest issues with the community rights initiatives, is it was establishing, giving inalienable rights to something that's not an individual human being. We are born with inalienable rights that don't require anything from you or you for me to exercise those rights. So I just want to be clear about that. I want to ask a couple quick questions because I want to, and this is to a point that comes to the motion. How much is our contract with a good company?
Contract, I believe it's in the packet there, was $85,000. Let's see.
84,664.
So roughly 85,000. Do you have any idea how much staff resource has been spent on this so far, dollar-wise?
I don't, Commissioner. We've stepped up a climate action team. There are about 8 people there. We've had probably 6 meetings, so under $10,000.
Yeah. And what's the proposed salary range for this new position?
I don't have that in front of me. I can look for that quickly, or I'm not. It's probably in the 100. 100,000 range when benefited.
What I'm trying to do is make a point of, is we're spending enough on this particular effort that could be spent on funding our new homeless and resource center for runaway youth. It could have been spent on a sheriff's deputy. It could have been spent on some of those enforcement FTE we need. Now my follow-up question.
Note, the funding for that position is coming out of the solid waste fund.
That's what was my next question, was what are the funding sources for all of this work? It's all coming out of tipping fees.
Correct.
And have we talked to the hauling industry about the fact that we're using tipping fees for this sort of work?
We have not, Commissioner.
My guess is they're not going to be happy.
And we have focused it there because, as we'll see when we bring the greenhouse gas inventory to you, that the landfill is the largest impact in county operations by far. So we felt it was appropriate to use those funds, and they have less restrictions.
Commissioner Farr.
Thank you, Chair Buck. You know, the thing that I'm looking forward to the most is a discussion regarding the resolution. Go ahead and talk, that's fine. No, that's fine, really. You can, because I'm talking to the cameras right now. I'm looking at you, but I'm talking to the cameras, all right? The discussion that's going to ensue surrounding this, and it'll be a robust discussion, and it'll occur at a lot of different levels, and in that it's not a binding, it's a resolution stating intention rather than actual commitment of resources to doing a broad range of activities. That discussion is going to happen. And as I look at Michael Johns over there, I know that part of the work that is being done right now has always been part of your work. It's not additional work that you're doing. It's always been a part of your work. I've been talking to you since the day I got here. And in fact, since the day I hired you at Jerry's many, many years ago. Of course, we didn't talk much about the environment then. We were talking about 2x4s for the most part. But you know, so the discussion that ensues from this is going to be a good one. It's going to be robust. And it'll, in part, the whereas in here, whereas we seek to establish best practices, or we aggressively employ best practices, I want to talk about something ever so briefly that I talk about very, very often. Short Mountain. What happens when it rains? Stuff leaches out of there, right? We have leach it. Is it nasty stuff? Is it qualified as nasty stuff? Okay, it is.
The water percolates through.
Yeah, that's what
This is what we call leachate, and we produce about 25 million gallons of leachate that has to be trucked and then goes through the treatment that the wastewater goes through.
And that was we truck it every day. About how many trucks a day? I think it's 12 to 24, depending on rain events, et cetera. And we've been doing that for years and years and years and years, probably 30 years. We've been trucking nasty stuff to the tune of 20 trucks a day up the freeway. If we're going to employ best practices, boy, we better get rid of that practice. We better find a better way to get that stuff from Short Mountain to Metropolitan Wastewater Treatment Plant.
We're working on that. That's
I know you are, because I talk about it all the time, but really it's nasty, nasty stuff. And it's 25 million gallons a year with an M, million gallons a year. Okay, all right, thanks. Best practices.
Any other comments? Discussion? Commissioner Bernie?
Yes, I simply want to say that I agree. It's going to be a robust discussion. I think that even the engineering for the pipe work that hopefully will directly respond to what Commissioner Farr mentioned is going quickly as it can.
Would have cost a lot less in 95. Proposed it.
And I agree that there is an opportunity cost in everything we decide to do. So thank you for clarifying the fund this comes out of, because that actually decreases what the opportunity costs were if it came out of the general fund. And again, I look forward to that robust discussion, and this is simply a resolution. I think it's more than symbolic, but I don't think it's binding yet. I look forward to the implementation discussion. Thank you.
I just want to add that in the Climate Action Plan, which this is output from the work on the Climate Action Plan, is part of our strategic plan as a county under Strategic Priority 2, Vibrant Communities. So I do feel like this work is part of what we as a whole on our board have decided is one of the most important things that we should be working on. And this resolution, as it's currently stated, we are in the beginnings of the county really putting more effort into this particular issue. I know we've done work in the past, which we've all mentioned up here, but I think this is a great push forward and an exceptional example and statement to the community about how important we think climate issues are. And that is extremely important. We have to juggle lots of really important things on our table, but acknowledging that this is one of those really high priorities is really important for us to share with the community. Thank you for putting it forward.
Can I add one thing to that? I'm
Yes,
sorry.
of course.
I just like to, because I have the permission of the chair to add on to her statement, and that is that additionally, I compliment you on creating a structural foundation so that when we move forward, we really are moving forward. That's not so easy. Many people in their haste will just say, yeah, we need to do this, but we're looking at structurally, pragmatically, practically, and inclusively moving forward on one of the issues of our time. So thank you very much.
Commissioner Farr?
Just a note, you weren't here this morning when I talked about the fact that Metropolitan Wastewater Management Commission had a full-day retreat yesterday. And a large part of that day was to talk about our strategies for the future and how we're going to progress into the future. No small part of that discussion was environmental and how we become partners with the agencies, the jurisdictions that we serve, Lane County, Springfield, and Eugene, in making certain that we do complete our mission, which is to discharge into the rivers in an environmentally progressive fashion. So it's not just us that are doing it, and we're in partnership with a great many other agencies who really have the same focus that you're beginning to describe, Mr. Hurley. Thank you.
Commissioner Sorensen?
I just want to mention that this is again in conjunction with the United Front trip that Lane Transit District has been attempting to find some research grants, demonstration grants, or other grants that could be used to operate some of their buses with the either pressurized or unpressurized gas from the Short Mountain landfill. And of course, that would take some cooperation with Emerald Peoples Utility District, Lane County, as well as LTD to see if we could increase the capture, because as you pointed out, the emissions from that facility are among the most damaging of all emissions in the Eugene, Springfield, maybe all of Lane County. And so are you working on that, or is there somebody in Public Works that's specifically working on that? Is
Yes,
Mr. Orlandini, your successor there at the Waste Management Division? Are you working on that?
I had a meeting today with LTD on that, along with some other county staff.
Okay. I know Congressman Fazio's interested in this. Senator Merkley specifically is interested in this. So it could well be that we could get some help to have some kind of demonstration. And wouldn't that be great if every landfill in America could capture usable gas for their mass transit? Wouldn't that be quite a difference? Thank you.
Okay, we have a motion on the floor made by Commissioner Sorensen, seconded by Commissioner Burney. Are we ready to vote? Okay, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. All those opposed say nay.
Nay.
Motion passes 4-1 with Commissioner Bozovich in the nay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioners. Thank you for your time and commitment, and thank you to the Climate Action Team that worked on this.
Thank you. We'll move on to item number 11, County Administration. Item A, which is Order 20-02-04-05. In the matter of using .74 acres, Lane County-owned tax lots 10-200, 10-300, 10-400, and 10-500 at the Lane Event Center for permanent supportive housing units for women and children, and supporting using the remaining property at the Lane Event Center for its current use. Mr. Mokhiski.
Thank you, Chair and Commissioners. This will be brief, but this is the draft board order, the proposed board order before you in response to last week's discussion and direction from the board to move forward. And so you'll see in the report, of course, just a reminder that the reason we're moving forward and need to identify a location for this project is because of funds available at the state of Oregon. The grant funding opens tomorrow, and we believe we have about 2 to 3 weeks to respond to that. So there's $4 million that is available for this project. Homes for Good work to identify and review and analyze over 10 properties in Lane County that we believe may have been suitable for this type of a project, and it was determined that given the time constraints and other restrictions that this property, this 0.74 acres at the fairgrounds, was best suited for this project. So I want to just briefly go through the board order. In the board order itself, the resolved clauses include allowing the 0.74 acres, the 4 tax lots that you noted, to be used for permanent supportive housing, specifically for women and children. So that is the proposal here. For formerly homeless women and children to be housed, that the current Board of Commissioners, understanding that you can't bind future boards of commissioners, but that your intent as a board is to support using the remainder of the Lane Event Center property in its current use, and that if the 0.74 acres is used to construct permanent supportive housing for women and children, that the transient room taxes that were used to purchase any of those properties would be reimbursed to the TRT funds that were used. So that's what the action by the board, an affirmative action by the board today would do.
Any questions or comments? If not, I will entertain a motion to approve Order 20-02-04-05 as presented.
Madam Chair, Chair Buck,
Yes.
I move passage of motion. Can you say those numbers again?
20-02-04-05.
Of 20-02-04-05.
Second.
Okay, we've got a motion by Commissioner Farr, second by Commissioner Sorensen. Any discussion? Commissioner Bozevich.
Thank you. And I made some of these concerns public last week and in the lead up to last week. I believe we're making a grave error. And I believe we're making that error chasing money for grant. We're permanently disposing of public property from one use to another without having sufficient master planning done. Our public process in doing so has been minimal. We haven't held a public hearing. I don't think there was notification to the Lane Event Center users groups. And I think that lack of transparency is something we should be embarrassed about. I believe that there are other options available for us if we try harder. It seems to me that, and much to my surprise, as I was sort of challenging the City of Eugene staff about the Santa Clara Community Park that they're getting ready to put on up there next to Madison Middle School, is there any leftover property that could be used for housing? They clearly stated no, that the property was too small for a regional park anyway, but they had identified other surplus properties. That was news to me, and it was the director of parks that stated that. Seems like we could hold off on this for a day or two and find out what those other properties are without jumping ahead of a master planning process. I also feel like the support we've gotten from the Fair Board and the Lane, Travel Lane folks has been without them having full knowledge of background information. Things like floodplain, and I know we've poo-pooed floodplain a little bit, but remember how hard it was to use the Armory for anybody staying overnight because the floor elevation was below the floodplain. So, you know, those issues are big issues. This is a permanent decision. And if we are this hard pressed for property to place into a land bank and to develop permanent supportive housing, which we also had a report last week that we're pretty damn far along in that 350 units. I was surprised how far we are. And the 16 to 20, 22, I keep hearing different numbers, is not going to make that big of a difference in achieving that. But we are going to make a permanent decision about the fairgrounds. So if we're deciding to do this without what I believe was good, transparent public process, without finishing a master plan, then I think we need to reconsider the sale of the River Road property that Homes for Good put up for sale. And I'm going to change my position on that because, you know, even though we had a strategic plan that showed we should dispose of that property, now that we're going to throw the babies out with the bathwater at the fairgrounds, I think we need to go back and look at that piece of property if we need that much property for affordable housing. So move forward with this with that understanding. But I think we can wait a couple more days, have a little bit more conversation about this, particularly seeing one of our partners around here didn't even realize we were looking for property until they saw my editorial in the paper. Now, they were unsuccessful in grabbing something quick, but what will another couple days do? Either that, I would really suggest amending this board order to allow for substitution of another property. But if you move forward, I'm going to be voting no on it, and I'm also going to be looking at that River Road property.
Any other discussion? Commissioner Sorensen.
I just want to say a few things in support of this motion. First of all, over the time I've been commissioner, we've both purchased property adjacent to and made it part of the fairgrounds. We've also sold property adjacent to the fairgrounds. I feel like this is a very minor amount of land that is involved, and the reason that, and I favor moving ahead with this, is that the housing professionals in Eugene and Springfield and Homes for Good and the nonprofit groups that are working mightily to try to address the housing crisis, they have really come together that this is the best single answer to the question posed by the speed at which the state is asking us to move. And to me, that is a very reasonable thing. Also, one thing that I wanted to ask Mr. Mokrajewski on that's of interest to me, and that is that the legal impediments to this seem minor, but one of the more important relationship components of this is getting the money that was put into this purchase of this land through certain types of funds, getting it repaid. I wonder if you could report on how that would, to the best of your current knowledge, how that would actually occur.
We're, Chair Buck and Commissioner Sorensen, we're continuing to analyze and understand exactly what the purchase prices were and have consulted with legal counsel on all that. It's my understanding, don't quote me on this, that the acquisition cost for the 4 tax lots was in the range of $120,000, give or take. So we'll quantify all of that. We're also want to quantify and make sure that all of those resources were in fact TRT was used, so we're verifying how much TRT was actually used, so that, because that's the intent here, is to reimburse any transient room taxes that may have been used to acquire properties, so that those resources are not impacted. And then we'll evaluate, the best way to move forward with that reimbursement, whether that's from the general fund or as part of the project, depending on what the grant funds may allow or other funding that may become available. So I don't have a specific answer for you because we're still in the process of evaluating all of that, but we certainly have committed to, and the board, if you approve this board order, would require us to reimburse any TRT that was used originally to acquire the properties.
Thank you. I think that's really important, and I'm glad to hear that that's going to happen. Thank you.
Any other? Commissioner
Thank you,
Farrar?
Chair Buck. The Poverty and Homelessness Board has been operating for a little over 5 years now on our strategic plan, and we do have a strategic plan that lasts through 2021, 16 through 2021. And I really am a firm believer in establishing strategic plans with strategies, goals, tactics, et cetera. And I'll get to that in just a second. But when I began considering, back in 1995, I went on a tour of available properties that are either land banked or being used for low-income housing. And at the time, it became really evident that while I was with the City of Eugene at the time, the City of Eugene was being aggressive, there was still always going to be a huge need for it. Well, that need is getting greater and greater, and we don't need to go into great detail on that right now. But I wanted to point out the strategic goals of the Poverty and Homelessness Board. The first goal is availability and access to coordinated supportive housing, shelter, and services. Goal 1.1 is to create 600 additional housing opportunities throughout Lane County by 2021. Not 350, but 600. And I'm sticking with that goal, and I'm gonna fight through that goal until it becomes evident that we've made it, or we need to extend the deadline on it. Then I look at the Lane County strategic plan, and 1.1 is affordable housing and homelessness. And I look at our measures of the entire block of measures for our strategic plan, and the first two listed are proportion of cost-burdened low-income households and the availability of supported housing units. It's something that we talk about all the time. And with this 0.74 acres out of 55-plus acres of the fairgrounds, it's a measure of our all hands on deck at all times to make sure that we achieve the goal of putting people in supportive housing units and other types of housing units that help us to reduce the homeless population, or the housing unstable population. This is a part of what we do. We're committed to it, and I am personally excited about the fact that we are using this piece of property that formerly was residential. Until just a few years ago, it was residential. It was in residential ownership. People were living there. We took it off of the housing market, and now we're putting it back on the housing market. It seems to me not just a good strategic move, but just a good good direction to be going, to return it to housing. And whereas before it had 3 residential units, I believe, which have been, 2 of them have been repurposed, now we're going to be housing 16 to 20 households of single parents with women with children. I think it's directly aligned with everything that we are pointing to as far as our housing goals and our housing initiatives and strategies. So I'm in favor of it. I made the motion, and I'm looking forward to breaking ground. And I will say that I've talked to a number of people who are interested in being there with shovels when it's time to break ground on the property. So thanks for the work that went into this, and thank you to the board for supporting moving forward with this. I received a message from Jay Mosley just this morning. Jay is from the neighborhood group, and Ms. Mosley has been in favor of using that portion of portion of land, that tiny little leg of land that's wrapped on 3 sides, by the way, currently by residential. It's got residential on 3 sides and formerly was residential. She's in favor of moving forward with it as quickly as possible, and she wishes us Godspeed on that. So thank you for bringing this forward, and I'm looking forward to the vote on it. Thanks.
Commissioner Rooney.
I think in these meetings, I have to preface my kidding remarks by saying I'm kidding. So I'm kidding when I say this also helps alleviate some of Chair Buck's concerns, because I know she was involved in taking houses off of that site, and now she'll be involved in putting units on that site. Let me also say some of what I think is positive that's come out of this process. Even though I agree with Commissioner Bozovich, it was not a good public process because we didn't have the time nor the circumstance to have a good public process. The city, Springfield, which I represent, has made it very clear to me through a couple of counselors that if there is another round of funding for housing, supported housing for women and children, families, they want to say yes in my backyard. They want to find a site. They would like to participate. They would like the construction activity. We would, et cetera. Two, this may be an interesting sort of a mix, but if Commissioner Bozovich chooses to change his feeling on the River Road property, he may have an ally in me. But we'll see how that goes. Finally, let me understand this. While not the ultimate ideal for the Fair Board, my understanding is that and my supporting of this relates to this will not represent any additional encroachment on the fairgrounds. This board is maintaining its commitment to working with the Fair Board on the fairgrounds and upgrading the facility as much and aggressively as we possibly can. Last week we did agree to underwrite the cost of a new HVAC system for one of the main halls at the fairgrounds. I believe that all the discussion has been consistent with that. Now, question, and I don't have the answer and I apologize. How long ago was this property purchased? Because there were 3 houses on it at one time, not in the too distant future. Is that not correct?
I believe there are 4 tax lots. It's my understanding that 2 to 3 of the tax lots were purchased in, three of the tax lots were purchased between the 70s and 80s.
Oh,
One or
okay, it
two
was
in the
longer ago than I
70s,
thought. Okay.
1 or 2 in the 80s, like 70-something and 82, I recall. And then the 4th tax lot was purchased around 2012, 13, 2012, yeah.
Okay.
And we
So I think the one that-
sold 3 houses on the east side,
I'm not aware of that.
on Jefferson Street.
And when the county makes a decision about allocation of TRT money, correct? So that when, I presume, I don't know, it actually precedes me, not living, but that when those purchases were made, the county allocated the TRT funds so the fairgrounds could purchase the property. Is that correct? I don't know.
I've got Mike Coles, 6'4".
Yeah, the Oregon Revised Statutes dictates how transient room taxes and oftentimes many state authorized taxes can be used. So transient room taxes are restricted for use on.
Hold on a moment.
Sure.
We can't hear you. Having technical difficulty.
I didn't know what that was.
It's not me. Not me.
He's, stuff it in the back.
Pat is telling me to shut up. No, it's quite all right. I'm sorry.
If you could repeat that a little bit.
I'm trying to remember what it was. You asked about TRT and the use of TRT.
What I'm trying to get at,
Yeah.
I apologize because I'm putting you on the spot, is if we're going to do this, which I'm going to vote to do this, I'm also never, as long as I'm a commissioner, going to vote to encroach on the fairgrounds again in any way, shape, or form. They've been integral to my life, my children's life, and my children's life. It just seems that we need to, I'm hoping that they net positive on this deal. I'm hoping that the TRT dollars that go to the fairgrounds in this or the Fair Board in this exchange exceed the TRT dollars in 78 or 2003 dollars that were used to purchase the property. I hope there's somewhere between what was spent and a fair market value that we can reimburse the fairgrounds to, again, demonstrate good faith.
And we're evaluating that. I will say that in the past, when road fund taxes have been used for a certain purpose and then required or desired to be reimbursed, they've always been, as I understand it, reimbursed at the rate at which they were originally used, not at a fair market. So we're going to look at that. I think, we're consulting with county council on what's going to be required on that front. I will just say that I think from the Fair Board's perspective that I've heard and from Land Event Center staff perspective, I think the real desire is a commitment for the long-term investment in that site and those facilities. Because it's not only the operations of the events that happen there, it's the people that are coming and holding events. You've heard from the Home and Garden Show individual who runs that, has been here for decades, and I think has a calendar out several decades. And so people are, I think they want to feel a sense of commitment that the board and the county are committed to this site and to making investments that will continue to maintain and improve those assets going forward.
That's how I read the letter. Is that correct? We're talking, okay. Then I'm good. If that's correct, then I'm good. Thank you.
Commissioner Bozievich.
Thank you. So, just to be clear, we've also gotten emails from folks that live within a house or two of this particular site asking us not to move forward. So there is not unanimous. In fact, most of the email traffic we've gotten has been against making this move. And in fact, my rural district, I would say it's somewhere in the 95 to 99% don't touch the fairgrounds. What surprises me is there is a site we could actually switch to. We could move this to the Musgrove site, the grant application. It's zoned correctly. Yes, it requires redevelopment of the site, but that's just a construction issue more than anything. So if you guys are committed to, my rural constituents see the fairgrounds as something that the county provides for rural in some ways. So I can't support chopping up the fairgrounds. I can't support taking a piece of the fairgrounds that's out of the floodplain either, without understanding how that impacts our ability to redevelop. Because we're certainly not going to tear down some of those buildings that are currently, people are booking out for decades to rebuild them. We're going to have to rebuild adjacent or next door, which is going to displace something else, and we're going to need a place to put that something else for a short term, which is one of the great things about having some extra property. So I would just ask again that the board reconsider moving forward today, ask staff to seriously look at whether the City of Eugene Parks folks have something or whether we can identify the Musgrove mortuary property. But the only reason I've heard for not doing the Musgrove mortuary property is we could use tax credit financing and another source of financing to build units there, which just basically says the only reason we're using the fairgrounds is because it's for this grant money. We can find someplace else to buy and use tax credit money for. We could use this grant right now today on the Musgrove mortuary property.
Any other discussion? Okay, we have a motion on the floor to approve Order 20-02-04-05. All those in favor say aye. Aye. All those opposed say nay.
Nay.
Motion passes with Commissioner Bozievich and the nay. We'll move forward to Commissioner's businesses. Any announcements? I know we had a lot earlier, but if there's any further. Commissioner Burney.
The Housing Policy Board, which I sit on at the behest of this Board of Commissioners, wanted me to announce that on Wednesday, February 12th from 4 to 6:30 p.m., the Eugene Springfield 2020 Consolidated Plan for Housing and Community Development will be discussed. Anyone from the public is invited to come and provide input. And it will be from 4 to 6:30 p.m. at World Pies Restaurant, 199 West 8th Eugene. The second thing I would like to announce, and this is the one I'm especially pleased to share, is that tomorrow is World Read Aloud to a Child Day. And Wednesday, February 5th, 2020, please take the Reading Matters Pledge and read aloud with a child on February 5th. On that day, Thurston Elementary School has been selected to sort of have a promo thing. So Thurston Elementary School is where my granddaughter goes to school. It's where my wife is the coordinator of the Smart Reading Program. So it will be my opportunity to be with Springfield Mayor Christine Lundgren and reading to children and have pictures taken. And I learned 3 days ago that this event is getting so much notoriety that Governor Brown will be joining us. I'm hoping perhaps I could also read a book to the governor. And so I just wanted to acknowledge February 5th, tomorrow, as World Read Aloud to a Child Day. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Any other announcements?
I'd like to announce that I read Bad Case of Stripes just yesterday aloud to a child.
It's daily at the firehouse.
I have one announcement, which is regarding our meetings next week. We have a full Tuesday again, but on the 12th, we have some guests from out of town coming to talk to us about census populations and redistricting. So make sure you keep your Wednesday, the 12th afternoon available. Any future board assignment requests, work sessions, whatnot? Commissioner Sorensen?
I just wanted to circle back on my suggestion that we refer to the legislative committee the matter of bringing in a draft of the 2021 United Front sometime, I'll just say, before August 30th, so that we are having a more open process for discussion of what goes into the United Front. And then somewhat related to that is having a board discussion of whether we want to invite in other governments. Mr. James from the Willamette Lane Park and Recreation District told me he's going to bring this up at an LCOG meeting where other governments may be present. The upside for these other governments is that they will get some help with grants that they're trying to advance. And the downside is that it costs money and that the smaller jurisdictions can't usually afford to be. But I think thinking about what Mr. James and I discussed of having 4J and LCC as part of it, and now that I think about it, I think, isn't the Bethel School District about the size of Springfield?
About half the size.
Oh, okay. Well, they may be kind of on the edge for participation, but because of the youth involvement of both Lane County Parks and Willamette Lane Park and Recreation District and the role of the public schools in youth, it may well be that we could get some greater synergy. So that would be my second. Have a board discussion of the pros and cons of inviting in the other jurisdictions.
Got a head nod from me? Yep. Okay. Those two sound good. Any other future board? Commissioner Bozovich.
So we've discussed quite a bit today about our need for operational funding and our lack of operational funding. And there was a statement made today about, we get the BLM money no matter what. We get secure rural schools money no matter what. Right now, even with the added cut BLM's projecting, which they don't have the staff to develop, which they don't staff because they're not being forced to, that's still not going to reach a harvest level that will exceed our current SRS payment. If we're expecting to increase our operational revenues without completely relying on property tax, which, by the way, I got a very interesting note, and I don't know if you guys got it too, from a U of O professor about how unfair property taxes and sales taxes are. Something he submitted to the Register Guard. I hope he sent it to you all too. If he didn't, I'll copy it to you. I think we need I'd like to ask for a future agenda item for us to reconsider our membership in the Association of O&C Counties.
I'm a head nod on that.
Don't we reconsider in the budget process?
I'd like to do it in advance, as soon as possible.
Are there 3 head nods? I see 2. Okay, I'm not seeing 3. So unless that changes, that one's not on the list. Okay. Any other future board assignment requests? All right, we'll move on to review of assignments.
So I have just the 2 items from Commissioner Sorensen, a discussion on a draft United Front overview at the Legislative Committee, and then a work session with the board to talk about our United Front process and issues. I don't know if I got those. Did I get those clear enough?
Is that what you intended?
One's a Legislative Committee item and one is a board work
Yeah,
session.
yeah.
But both on United Front.
Thanks.
Okay, that's the only addition. Any other business that anybody wants to bring forward? Okay, I see none. So today's meeting is adjourned.